Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event, which I'm delighted to welcome you to on behalf of the Stanley Burton Centre for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. So my name is Paul Moore. I'm one of the directors of this centre, and it's a great pleasure to again collaborate with two very fine institutions, the Wiener Holocaust Library in London and our friends at the Institute for the History of the German Jews in Hamburg. This is, I believe, the third time we've collaborated together on one of these events, and it's particularly gratifying, particularly important, I think, to work together, not only across borders, but between city and provinces to mark this important occasion. So this is an event for Holocaust Memorial Day under the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day for a Better Future. I won't spend too long introducing things. I'll hand over very shortly to my colleague to introduce the individual speakers, but just to very briefly set out how things will work tonight. So the title for today's event is "Where is My Grandfather? A Family History of the Holocaust in Hungary." And the first 20 to 30 minutes will be comprised of a conversation between two of our speakers. And that's very much focused on the personal story, a family history of the Holocaust. And very often we find with these events, one is served up one or the other. One either gets sort of a historical lecture, or one hears very importantly from a survivor or an individual account, and we thought it was important to try to bring you both today. So we'll begin, as I say, with the personal discussion, conversation, and then we'll move to a talk from Tim Cole, Professor Tim Cole, who'll in a sense have helped to sort of contextualize what we've heard already from the first two speakers. So zoom out and talk about what that story might be able to tell us about the Hungarian experience of the Holocaust and Holocaust history more generally. And so just in terms of the sort of practical housekeeping matters, if you like, so this event is being recorded, and I'm reliably informed, I don't understand the technology of this myself, but I'm reliably informed that people asking questions will not appear on screen. They will not be recorded themselves. It's just ourselves leading this event that will be visible. So if that reassures, just to make that clear right at the beginning. So as I said, we'll have essentially two talks to comprise the main body of the event. There will be time for questions afterwards, however. So what I would ask people do is that they type their questions in, or indeed their comments, into the chat function on Zoom, and those will then be they will then form the basis for that Q&A discussion afterwards. But I'll hand over then, without further ado, to my dear friend and colleague Kim Wunschmann, the director of the Institute for the History of the German Jews, and she will introduce tonight's speakers for us. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you very much, Paul, and very good evening. Guten Abend from Hamburg. As you heard, my name is Kim Wunschmann. I'm the director of the Institute for the History of the German Jews here in Hamburg, and I extend a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for this very special event marking Holocaust Memorial Day, which this year, as we've just heard from Paul, stands under the theme for a better future. We remember the victims, we honor the survivors who inspire us to stand up for this mission, to carry it into the future, especially as we are witnessing an alarming rise of anti-Semitism around the globe and are urgently called upon to defend democracy, human rights, and our free and diverse societies. This year, as we've already heard, we remember the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the largest, the Nazi concentration camps. And we also remember the liberation of the Budapest ghetto in January 1945, and with it, the Holocaust in Hungary. 1 in 10 Holocaust victims came from Hungary within its borders at the time, and over 500,000 of Hungarian Jews were murdered by the Nazis and their allies. Together with our partners in Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania, the Institute for the History of the German Jews conducts a research and remembrance project on the deportation of the Hungarian Jews. It was mostly via Auschwitz as the hub for the forced labor deployment of prisoners in the German war industry that tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews were deported to camps in northern Germany, the region in which our institute is situated. What we found is that 80 years after the Holocaust in Hungary, we are still confronted with gaps in our historical understanding of the violent events. The fates of tens of thousands of these Jewish deportees remain unknown. And this uncertainty troubles many surviving families. As we become the generations who carry forward the legacy of the witnesses and remember those who were murdered, we see that more and more descendants embark on the quest to reconstruct their family histories of the Holocaust. And on her mission to find out what happened to her grandfather, the Budapest-based writer and journalist Judith Karpati reached out to us. And with the help of our dear colleague historian Louis Werner, she was able to find new traces to reconstruct her grandfather's fate. The Nazis deported Laszlo Schechter from Hungary in 1944 and deployed him for forced labor in camps in northern Germany, where he perished. We are extremely grateful to Judith that she agreed to speak about her mission to find out what happened to her grandfather, a mission that is oriented towards the future, to again pick up this year's theme for Holocaust Memorial Day. Judith will reflect on the importance of history for her own family, as well as for society at large. And we will first hear her in conversation, and then Professor Tim Cole will contextualize this family story within a broader history of the Holocaust. And I would like to quickly introduce each of the three speakers. Judith Karpati studied international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she later worked as a PR expert on various corporations, including the largest Hungarian film distributor. For the past 18 years, she's been a freelance PR specialist, broadcaster, and writer. She's a columnist for Maiga Narancs, Hungary's leading socio-political cultural weekly, known for pioneering gonzo journalism. And for the past 2 years, she's been researching the life stories of her ancestors to be published in a forthcoming book. In her investigation of her grandfather's fate, she has published parts of her findings on her personal story, combined with exchanges on the history of the Holocaust that she had with survivors, historians, archivists, and other experts in many European countries. Louis Werner studied history here at the University of Hamburg, and as a historian and activist, he deals with the history and the remembrance of Nazism and forced labor in northern Germany. In 2017, Louis co-founded the initiative Dessauer Ufer, which campaigns for preserving and for turning into a memorial site the Lagerhaus G, the site of one of Neuengamme's largest subcamps here in the city of Hamburg. Louis also works as a guide in the Neuengamme concentration camp memorial. And as a historian, he contributes to our EU-funded transnational project entitled Digital Commemoration and Research Infrastructure, the Holocaust in Hungary 80 years later. Louis researches deportees from Hungary to Neuengamme concentration camp and to its subcamps. And in the process, he also came across the story of Laszlo Schechter, Judith's grandfather. Tim Cole is professor of social history at the University of Bristol in the UK. His research ranges across social, cultural, environmental, and landscape histories, with a particular interest in the Holocaust and its memory. Tim is the author and the editor of a number of books that include a study of the ghettoization in Budapest entitled Holocaust City, published in 2003, a socio-spatial history of the Holocaust in Hungary entitled Traces of the Holocaust, published in 2011, and books on geographies of the Holocaust, published in 2014 and 16. Tim is currently co-writing a book on the role of monuments in democracies, as well as working on digital humanities projects related to the Holocaust and its aftermath. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to you, Judith and Louis. We are very much looking forward to your conversation.
Yeah, thank you for your introduction, and thank you, Judith, for being here. I think we will right start. And Judith also brought some pictures with her, so I will share this presentation with you all so that you can see the pictures that Judith brought with her. And I will dive right in and ask you, because it's called "Where's My Grandfather?" and you researched the history of your father, Istvan Schechter, and grandfather Laszlo Schechter, from whom you also brought pictures. And maybe you can start by telling us who your grandfather was and what happened to him.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. First of all, let me say that because of the Holocaust, my father and my grandfather had never chance to know each other. And because of that, I had no grandfather. I never had a grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
So in this picture, you can see my grandfather, the child with his 4 siblings. But the next picture.
Yeah, you also brought a picture of your grandfather and your grandmother. Can you tell us when they got married?
So during the war, in 1942, my paternal grandparents, Clara Grünberg and László Schechter, got married in Budapest. Shortly after their wedding, my grandfather was taken away to labor service.
Mm-hmm. I think we maybe later we'll hear something more about the labor service from Tim Cole, because it's a rather unique institution in the Hungarian Holocaust. What can you tell us about? And I think you also brought some photos of your grandfather Laszlo Schechter in the labor service.
Yes, you're right. That was really a unique institution of the Hungarian Holocaust. It was a specialty. A kind of forced service without weapons. And the cause of that called often army of shovels. And the picture before that, yes, you can see my grandfather with a shovel. Illustrated this kind of thing. So during the years of the labor service, my grandfather could visit a few times with my grandmother. And when my grandmother became pregnant, she could convince him to keep the baby. And the relatives and the friends said that there is no time for babies, but my grandmother was very determined, and thanks to her persistence, my father was born. And so today I'm here with all of you.
And this was before the German occupation?
Yes, that's before. Shortly after the wedding, my grandfather went to Sárospatak, and in 1943 at Kolozsvár, and other places I don't know, but he went several places under this.
You also brought a photo of your father, Istvan Schechter, in March 1944, which is the month the German army invaded Hungary.
This is a very sad photo to me, because my father was born in January 12th, 1944, and I know that it's about March because of the baby is able to lift his head, so it's approximately 3 months old. He's approximately 3 months old in this picture, and we know the facts that in March 19, the Nazi Germany occupied Hungary. So that framed that picture. That happy picture. And maybe that picture sent my grandmother to my grandfather to the labor service just to introduce that this is your boy.
Because at this time your grandfather was still in the labor service and your family was living in Budapest. But you also told me that it then changed. Your grandfather didn't.
Yes, that changed because my grandfather was escaped from the labor service in November to see his baby boy. And at that time, the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nazis, took full power, and they manhunt the Jews in Budapest between 15 to 60 who was still able to work. And the janitors, even the janitors were ordered to report the hiding Jews to the authorities. And I don't know who and why and in which circumstances, but informed the janitor of that building. And the next morning, the Arrow Cross took away the whole family. That means that the family, my father and my grandfather and my grandmother was a family just for one night and one day.
I think Tim Cole will maybe also be able to later tell us something about the role of janitors in this time. But to get back to your family again, they were arrested by the Arrow Cross. What happened then to your family? Or what happened to your grandfather?
By the family oral history, my grandmother and my father were pushed away from the line by a guard, and they saved their lives. But my grandfather deported to Neuengamme in the first days of November, and he arrived there in November 18, and he never returned. In this picture, you can see the number. I know it from my heart. This number.
The number on the right side.
I have no grandfather, but I have a number. This 65550. That means my grandfather to me. So he never returned, and he never saw his son again, and he never knew that his son and his wife survived the Holocaust, and his son had children, and one of his grandchildren would one day retrace his footsteps and will tell his story to the world.
Yeah, I think we probably could talk about the history of your grandfather alone for like an hour or more. But I'm also interested in your father, because even though he was an infant, he did survive the Holocaust. So you're not only the granddaughter of a Holocaust victim, but also the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Can you maybe tell us something about the life of your father István Schechter after the Second World War?
My grandmother and my father lived in Budapest after the World War. Maybe you remember my grandmother's face before the World War, and you can see here. And in the wall, that little picture, this is my grandfather. So what happened after the World War? They lived in Budapest, and however, the Nazis were gone, but the anti-Semitism stayed. And my father wrote a book, and I found a short story when my my father went in a public restroom as a child, and there were two older boys. And my father heard they say, "Let's cross our streams when we pee, so a Jew dies."
So anti-Semitism stayed a part of his life.
Yes.
And he was still missing his father, Laszlo Schechter. Can you tell us something about that as well?
Excuse me?
His grandfather, grandfather Laszlo Schechter never came home. How did your family deal with that? Did they know what happened to him?
You know, the families who survived the Holocaust mostly just handled their everyday life and didn't want to thinking about what happened. And my father often asked my grandmother that why I haven't daddy, and my grandmother one day met a man, a Holocaust survivor, another Holocaust survivor, and she went to ask her stepmother to a permission to remarry with this man who deported to Don River, and his whole family deported to Auschwitz and lost his mother and other relatives. And this man, my step-grandfather, Kraus Aaron, adopted my father at age 9. And because of the Holocaust, Aaron Kraus changed his name, a much Hungarian-sounded Kárpáti. So my father changed his name at age 9 from István Schechter to István Kárpáti. And here I am, Judit Kárpáti, originally Judit Schechter.
So you still carried both these names with you. And as I understand, your father István later did research the fate of his grandfather, of his father Laszlo Schechter.
Yeah, yes. When he was at his 40s, started to research and corresponding with historians and researchers, but it was a pre-internet time, and spent for decades until he found the traces, his father, and he learned that his dad been sent to Neuengamme. And I have a memory from my father when my father saw his father's name on an original document in Neuengamme's archive. He just collapsed and had to be taken away in an ambulance, like at the Hollywood movies.
Because still was painful. It stayed a painful process for him. Do you know how he dealt with this history?
The same situation when I was in Neuengamme. That's my hand, and it was also shocked to see this list with the names.
You brought also a photo of your father István Schechter from this time. I think he's here on the right-hand side of this photo here. Can you tell us maybe something?
Yes, this is my 60 years old father. What happened? So this picture is a ceremony of Bremen, because my grandfather became the first Hungarian to be remembered with a stumbling stone in Germany. And the mayor of Bremen, who was Henning Scharf at that time, organized a very nice ceremony where my mother read the names of the Hungarian victims because my father couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm. We know from other Holocaust survivors that they often experience a form of guilt, like survivor's guilt. Can you tell us something about if your father experienced something similar?
A month ago, Barbara Yor, who is a filmmaker, but who wrote a book about Bremen's Stolpersteines, it's a stumbling stone, told me a story about my father. My father told her that that he lived with guilt all of his whole life, because he believed that his father came home for him and died because of it. And unfortunately, that guilt herited to me, because I often feel some kind of guilt that I not deserve the safety. That's my feeling about that. And
yeah, that's really hard to hear, because of course, and but we also know that some of these traumas did affect following generations. So can you maybe share a bit more about your experience and what role this family story played for you?
So it was so hard. It was a long way, and for a long time in my young ages and later, I didn't face my father's story and my family story because it was too hard, and I turned my face, my head away from it, and it was also very difficult to see that my father cried when the Holocaust came up in conversations at television and from other articles, and I realized that he would start sobbing. It was awful, always. And I have a story that then all of us was in a hospital. We both in the hospital. I was because of the birth of my son, and my father because he was very sick. He had a cancer, and he said when I called from the delivery room that it's almost my newborn son is here. He told me to think of his father and the struggles he went through, and that would make the birth easier. And I think it was both touching and a huge burden to me, because he connected with my newborn son to my grandfather, who I would never meet, and who had been murdered.
Yes, I can imagine, and I can't imagine how much of a burden that must have been. And it's also very understandable that at first you didn't want to engage with the family history. But we're here today because at some point that did change, and you began your own research. Can you tell us about what changed? So when
what changed from my father's research?
No, when did it? Can you tell us when you began your own research, and when did you start engaging with this history, and how?
Sorry, I don't understand clearly what you asked me. Sorry.
At one time, you did start to engage with the history of your murdered grandfather and started your own research.
Yes. So, okay, about my research.
Mm-hmm.
So, one day for 2 years before, I bought a plane ticket to Hamburg, and I went to Neuengamme, and it was the first step. And I realized that I want to research the whole story, and I want to know what was the last steps of my grandfather, and and I wanted to know what happened, and when I started that, I realized that I have to go the places where think what happened, and it's a kind of method that not researching from behind the desk, but visit the places. And it's different because just researching from the internet, because I often speak with local people and historians and librarians, and it's a field works. It's full of interviews, and it's totally different than just sitting and researching, and sometimes people talking to other researchers that finding their roots, but it works.
And you also publish some of the results you find, and you publish articles, and I think you're collecting also material for books.
Yes, and it's not just about my family. It's about other people's families, and related with my grandparent, and because I'm journalist, it's totally different, and I always find new stories, and my favorite. I don't know this word, but the report is my table, and I try to interview the different peoples and different persons, and to write and to paint a whole picture about what happened. And when I write an article, there was a sentence that when I started to research, very soon found a much more beautiful part of the life.
This is also how at one point we came in contact. Can you maybe tell us something about how you came in contact with the Hungary project?
So it was in Budapest a conference, and I noticed that one of the speakers was a German historian who had a lecture about Neuengamme, because he was the historian, and I was very curious because it was about Neuengamme, and it's not a very well-known camp in Hungary. So I went to the conference, and it was fascinating, and also the lecture was it. And at the end of that lecture, I went up to the historian. I went to introduce me to you, and I told you that I was the granddaughter of a Neuengamme victim, and searching my grandfather's final resting place. So we spoke for a few minutes and exchanged contact details. And a few weeks later, you received a letter with totally new information, which made it more than 90% likely that my grandfather had been deported by the Nazis in the last days of the war to Bergen-Belsen in a wagon, in a cattle wagon.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that I could give you that information and help you. And I think it's maybe seemingly small encounters like these showed, at least for me, the responsibility and impact that historical research projects like Hungary can have. But on a side note, I think it's also important to note that the information that I could give you was also heavily based on the published memoirs of a survivor. So the work of survivors and descendants, like your father and yourself, is actually something we as historians owe a lot to, which also leads me to maybe my next question. From your point of view, what is the relationship between your form of research and publications and academic research?
I think it's a really important thing to me, to connecting with experts as you, because this is a fact-based thing. It's you and your colleagues give me fact-based materials, and my personal stories and traces what I found and I research is connected with this kind of fact-based materials, and this mixture give I think new things to the community and for the other Holocaust not survivors, but the descendants of survivors, and not just for them, but all of the people in this era. I visited Hanna Kral, maybe you know Hanna Kral, the famous Polish reporter last year at November, and who writes in her book about the memoirs of the commander of the Warsaw Ghetto that one Jew is more than 400, and 400 is more than 400,000, and 400,000 is more than 6 million. So that means every individual story is a part of the story of the Holocaust victims, and it's much easier to uncover the fates of those whose name would otherwise fade into oblivion when we as descendants investigate them. So academic knowledge is a background for the personal stories.
Yeah, and just to add, this not only shows the value academic research maybe has for the research of descendants, but also again how important the personal research of descendants is to gain a more comprehensive picture of the Holocaust and have actual personal stories.
So I always have questions. For example, what does it really mean to be a victim? Because just my grandfather was a victim who paid with his life, or after all, the loss might be even greater for those who lost him. Me, my grandmother, my father, the grandchildren, and my son also. So my grandfather's story is not an only story at my family, because not just Nyangama is my story. I have relatives who died in Auschwitz and in Novi Targ and in Belzec and many others. and I have a responsibility to tell these stories and to speaking about that and writing about that because I think the reality today is a message that this can happen again at any time, and the past can repeat itself.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I have nothing to add to that, but I want to thank you again very deeply for sharing your personal family history and also for your, I think, very important work. And thank you again for that.
Thank you to be here. Thank you, Louise.
Great. What I wanted to do was maybe just to kind of put a little bit of Judith's grandfather's story and her grandmother's story and her father's story into a sort of wider context. And maybe just to talk really quickly about three things that I think are particularly relevant. First of all, we've already got a sense of this, the gendering of the Holocaust in Hungary. So to say a little bit more about how Hungarian Jewish men and Hungarian Jewish women had such different experiences. This is true across the Holocaust, but I think it's particularly distinctive in Hungary. Secondly, to say a little bit more about Budapest, and in particular, to say a little bit more about the role of janitors in Hungarian házmesterek, so these caretakers or janitors who were quite literally gatekeepers, often of life and death in Budapest. And Budapest, I think, is an unusual city in terms of the Holocaust. And then I wanted to finish with some work I've been doing more recently, which is to think about the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust and the experience of Judith's grandmother and Judith's father waiting for news of their husband or father. You know, this kind of sense of, you know, the way that therapists talk about this is they talk about the idea of ambiguous loss, when you don't know whether someone is alive or dead yet. It's a state of ambiguous loss. And I want to say a little bit more about that. But maybe first of all, gendering of the Holocaust in Hungary. And I think it is one of the things that's really distinctive in the Hungarian case. We already heard this phrase, Labour Service Battalion, and that Judith mentioned, and Louis said that I'd say a little bit more about it. And it is one thing that's really distinctive about the experience of Jewish men in Hungary. Essentially, what happens is that Hungary allies itself with the Axis powers, so with Nazi Germany. And there's a big debate about when you come into a war like that, what do you do about recruiting men into the military? Do you recruit all men into the military? Do you call up all men into the military? But what do you do about Jewish men? So in a context of Hungary where you've got anti-Semitism, state anti-Semitism, what do you do in 1941 when you enter the war? If you're going to start sending non-Jewish Hungarians to the front, do you also start sending Jewish Hungarians to the front? And so what happens is that the Hungarian state comes up with this solution, in a sense, which is to send Hungarian non-Jewish men to the front as soldiers, and to send Jewish Hungarian men to the front as Labour Service Battalion or Auxiliary Labour Service Battalion members. And essentially they're armed with a shovel rather than a rifle. So what they've got is they've got a spade over their shoulder and they're unarmed, and they're going to dig trenches or earthworks alongside the military, do whatever kind of labouring job needs to be done alongside the Hungarian army. And one thing that we know is that there's incredibly high casualty rates amongst Hungarian Jewish men in 1942, and in particular in 1943. January 1943, the Soviets pushed through the Hungarian front line and really decimate the Second Hungarian Army. The estimates of death rates are that maybe as many as 85% of Hungarian Jewish men in Labour Service battalions in the Second Army died during the war. And that compares to mortality rates for non-Jews, which are about 65%. So you've got very high mortality of both Jews and non-Jews, but higher in the case of Jews. And this is because of the kind of vulnerability that Jews face, and also because of the kind of treatment they receive within the Hungarian military. And so in 1941, in particular in 42, especially in 1943, Hungarian Jewish men are dying in very large numbers. And Laszlo, in a sense, is fortunate to survive, because most of the men who are in labor service battalion service in this period do not survive. So most Jewish men who are in labor service battalions aren't returning home in 1943, after 1943. Now, the thing that's a bit odd in the Hungarian case is that this all kind of flips in 1944. So if you think about 1941, 42, 43, the thing you don't want to be is a man if you're Jewish. But in 1944, in some ways, you kind of do want to be a man if you're Jewish, because of what happens in 1944, which is that the Germans occupy Hungary in March 1944. It's an odd occupation because it's the occupation of an ally. But it's the occupation of an increasingly reluctant ally. And so Germany occupies Hungary. And what you start to get is the implementation of a whole series of anti-Jewish measures. Jews are marked with a star. They're placed into ghettos. And crucially, you get the beginnings of deportations. And most of those deportations are to Auschwitz. And the thing that's very striking, I think, about the Hungarian context of the Holocaust is how quickly it takes place. So it's just 56 days between the German occupation and the first deportations. And then it's only 56 days between the first deportations and the last deportations. And during that period, about 430,000 Hungarian Jews are deported from Hungary. And they're sent, most of them, to Auschwitz, where the vast majority are murdered on their arrival. Now, the thing that is striking, I think, and I did a little bit of work on this, looking at some of the Jews in a place called Veszprém in the west of Hungary, is that if you look at who is ending up on those trains, so which Jews are ending up on those trains being sent to Auschwitz, it's essentially three categories of people. It's Jewish women, it's Jewish children, and it's Jewish elderly. Because all of the men, the young men, adult men, are in labor service battalions. Originally, when labor service battalions are set up in 1941, it's Jewish men who are in their 20s and 30s and very young 40s who are called up. In 1944, it's increased to be anyone who's 18 plus, all the way up to late 40s. And so you get essentially an entire cohort of Jewish men who are put into labor battalions rather than put into deportations to Auschwitz. And so in 1944, if you're a Jew and you live outside of Budapest, it's worse to be a woman than it is to be a man. Like, there's higher survival rates from men than there are from women. But there's another exception, which is Budapest, because everything changes in Budapest in July 1944. So the way that the deportations operate in Hungary is essentially it's done on a kind of zonal system. So starting in the kind of peripheries of Hungary, in the former border areas up in the north or in the south, and then gradually coming through central Hungary to the west, with the idea that the deportations will last take place from Budapest. Scheduled for July 1944, about 200,000 Jews may be living in Budapest at this point of the war, a little bit less than 200,000 Jews. But the deportations are halted by the Hungarian Regent Admiral Horthy, I think in large part because of pressure that is coming underneath from the allies, Western allies, and also from neutral legations. You know, it's interesting, if you look in the Foreign Office documents in Budapest in the archives, you see a lot of stuff coming through. They're really conscious of what the Swedes and the Swiss are saying. I think at this point in the war, this is July 44, it's after D-Day, people are really starting to think about the end of the war, and they know which way the war is going to end. And so as a result of that, what Horthy does is he stops the deportations in Budapest. And so unusually in Budapest, Jews in the main survive. Not entirely, I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But in a sense, at that point in the war, it's better to be a Jewish woman than a Jewish man. So it's better to be Judith's grandmother in Budapest in the autumn of 1944 than to be Judith's grandfather, because men are still serving in labor battalions. And as Judith's story shows, what often happens is that men are no longer serving within Hungary, or on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is pushed by this point. You know, July 1944, the Soviets have already liberated Majdanek, and they're pushing increasingly westwards. And so what you have is that, in a sense, the Germans are mobilizing Jewish labor, male labor, in particular within the last camps that are existing. And Neuengamme is a classic camp of this outside of Hamburg. It's a camp that's originally created largely to make bricks, to build the Führer city of Hamburg. It's got a huge brick factory in the camp. And this is where Jewish labor is being deployed at this late stage of the war. Or in the increasing chaos, right at the very end of the war, in a sense, Bergen-Belsen becomes the only place where Jewish labor is being deployed. It's not being utilized. It's a place where people are being taken simply to die. So you've got this really odd sense of Hungary. It's almost, I think, a story in three acts, where in 1942-43, it's Jewish men who are being targeted as Labour battalion servicemen. In 44, with the deportations, it's Jewish women, children, and the elderly from everywhere else in Hungary who are being deported. And in large part, I think Hungary sees them as useless. It sees them as having no labour value. It's hanging on to its men. It's pulling men out of ghettos because it sees some value to labour. And then right at the end of the war in 44, it's back in Budapest to actually, there's a higher survival rate amongst Jewish women than Jewish men. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. And so I think gender is really critical to understand the Holocaust in Hungary. In a sense, Judith's story is a fairly typical story. If she told me I had a grandfather and a grandmother in Budapest, one of them survived, who would you say it is? I'd say it's the grandmother who survives, because she's in Budapest and the deportations are halted, and she's a woman who's not been called up for labour. I'd say I think it's probably your grandfather who died. And so Judith's story is a fairly typical story in many ways of the way that the Holocaust in Hungary targets men and women at different times in different ways. And I think a lot of that boils down to ideas of value, of labour value. There's a sense of whose Jewish body is valuable for who at what time. Jewish men's bodies are seen as valuable by the Hungarian state. Right at the very end of the war, there is some mobilization of Jewish women for Budapest, but some Jewish women are seen of value by the German state, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are moved into the labor camp system out of Auschwitz. But actually what you find is in a sense, no one cares about the children and the elderly, that they're of no value to the Hungarians who deport them, and they're of no value to the Germans who murder them in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. But the gendering of the Holocaust is really critical, I think, for the whole story of the Holocaust, but it's particularly critical in the case of Hungary. Second, let me just say quickly a little bit about Budapest, because Budapest is, again, this really odd city, in part because deportations are halted. And so Jews actually survive in Budapest up until liberation by the Soviets in the middle of January 1945. But another odd thing about Budapest is that Jews live in a very unusual ghetto. So when we think of ghettos, and ghettos are implemented across Eastern Europe, not in Western Europe, but across Eastern Europe, in most places, Jews are placed into ghettos. And in Hungary, they're placed into ghettos. Traditionally, a ghetto is a part of a city which is fenced or walled off, and Jews are crowded in there prior to deportation. So that's what happens across Hungary, in towns and cities across Hungary. But in Budapest in the summer of 1944, what actually happens there is that Jews are placed into apartment buildings, about 2,000 apartment buildings spread all the way across the city that are marked with a big yellow star just outside the door. So they're called yellow star houses. Sárga csillagos házak is the name that's used for these in kind of common parlance. And the thing that I think's particularly interesting, and you didn't mention this, is that in the houses, one thing that the Hungarian authorities permit is they permit non-Jewish tenants to stay living in their apartment within the house. And so they're all actually mixed houses. The vast majority of them are mixed houses where Jews and non-Jews are living alongside each other. But particularly important is the man or woman who lives by the gate and is the caretaker of the house. If you've been to Budapest, you'll know that most people live in large apartment buildings, in particular in the older parts of the city, in the central districts of Pest. And these are large apartment buildings which has got a big front door, so a big kind of gate, and then you go inside, there's a courtyard, and around are maybe 3 or 4 floors with a staircase and a balcony, an internal balcony, and then the flats off of that facing either onto the street or off to the sides or to the back of the building, and also facing out onto this internal courtyard. Now, what the guy or woman who owns the building does is they employ someone to live in a tiny flat by the gate to do a few things. So to clean the staircases, just to make sure that there's order in the building, because they own the building. The guy or woman who owns the building want to make sure that things are working okay, and crucially to open the gate. So what happens in these buildings is that you don't have a key to the gate. The gateway traditionally was open during daylight hours and closed at night. At a certain time it would be closed, and if you got home late, from the pub or something, you'd need to kind of ring the bell, like apologize to the caretaker, come into the building, and then you could go up to your flat, and maybe you give them like a few pengo, like a little bit of cash, as a kind of tip, you know, as a sort of thank you for their kindness. One of my former students, a guy called Istvan Adam, he's written about this, really great book on these janitors. And what he points to is that during the context of the war, the person who opened the gate was suddenly, in a sense, the most important person as to whether you lived or died. And this happened in all sorts of ways. In Budapest, there's actually a curfew, so Jews can go out from these buildings in the city to go and say, go to the market to shop. The caretaker decides whether they inform if you come back after the curfew or not. And one thing that Istvan points out is that the tipping system grows in value during the war. Like, when does a tip become a bribe, or when does a bribe become a kind of source of enrichment? That rather than just paying a few pengo, you have to pay a lot of money to keep the janitor on your side. Or in Judith's case, one of the things that happens in Budapest, and again, this is one of the complexities of the Hungarian Holocaust, is that the kind of pre-war Hungarian state is in existence until October 1944. And then you get, when Hungary tries to pull out of the war, you get essentially a Nazi puppet state, the Arrow Cross, Nyílás Party, the Hungarian native fascist party, who come into power. And one of the things that happens there is you get these raids on these Yellow Star buildings. And if an Arrow Cross group come and raid a building, in a sense, the janitor is the crucial person who decides whether they allow them in, and who they say is Jewish in the building, and whether they allow someone to hide or whether they allow someone to escape. And so these janitors play this kind of critical role, I think, in Budapest in the second half of 1944. They really are the difference between life and death. And just one thing that, you know, has always struck me about them is that I think it made a huge difference as to whether you were a pre-war tenant or a post, or only became a tenant in 1944. So if you think about ghettoization, essentially what ghettoization means across Eastern Europe is it means taking large numbers of Jews and forcing them into increasingly smaller living places. And so most of those that are arriving in Yellow Star buildings are people who haven't lived there before the war. If you've lived there before the war, you've got a relationship with the Hausbester, with the janitor. Like, you've got several years. You know them by name, they know you. Maybe they're someone who, if you increase tipping, maybe they'll look after you a little bit more. If you've just arrived there in June or July 1944, you have no relationship. In a sense, I think it's a very different situation. And one thing that Jews really talk about is that those social networks could be critical in ensuring survival. And one of the things that I think is interesting about Istvan's work is that he finds that it's not as simple as saying some janitors helped and some janitors harmed. Actually, some janitors helped some people in their house and harmed some people in their house. And a lot of that was based on pre-war social relations. And at that micro scale, I think, of individual buildings, there's these people who are playing this kind of critical life and death role. And you see that very much with Judith's grandfather and grandmother's story, that the janitor plays a critical role in deciding whether these Jews are to be given over to the Arrow Cross or not at this point in the war. Just final thought is really on what happens in the post-war city. And I think one thing that I've been doing recently with a colleague of mine called Alberto Giordano is doing some work with digital humanities methods to try and think about how many Jews were there living in Budapest who were like Judith's grandmother or like Judith's dad. So living in this state of ambiguous loss in the city in 1945. And one of the things that helps here is that we have an incredible source, which is this book. It's called Counted Remnant. It's a survey taken of Jews living in Budapest in the summer of 1945 by a whole set of Jewish organizations. And it contains over 70,000 names, because a very large number of Jews survive in Budapest because of the reasons I've just spelt out, you know, because deportations are halted there. Mainly the majority names of women. One of the things that we started to do was we started to work with the niceties of the Hungarian language, not to get too technical, but if you marry in Hungarian tradition, then you assume the name of your husband in a kind of full way. So if you're Kárpáti László, you become Kárpáti László Né. So literally the wife of Kárpáti László. And so this linguistic clue means that using digital humanities techniques, we can look through that source of 70,000 and we can work out who are the men who are missing. who aren't officially the dead husbands of widows, but nor are they present in the city, but are what we term ghost husbands. They're these kind of men who are neither dead nor alive. They're somewhere between a survivor and a victim in the summer of 1945. What's extraordinary is we found 13,000 of them in this collection of 70,000, that most married women in Budapest who weren't a widow were living not knowing if their husband was alive or dead. They lived in this ambiguous state. And maybe I just finished with two examples of that. You know, Louise talked about the kind of way that I think, as we think about the big history, the kind of broader context, I think it's also critical to pull that down to a local level. There's a guy called Laszlo Mandel who gives a testimony to the Visual History Archive, Shoah Foundation Archive, and he talks about in 1948, he goes to the railway station, the main railway station, the Eastern Railway Station in Budapest, with his mum, and they're going in 1948 to meet his dad. And he hasn't seen his dad for 7 years. They finally found out that his dad's alive, and he's brought back to Budapest. And he talks about being so embarrassed because he doesn't recognize him. And he has to ask his mum who his dad is, because everyone looks the same, because he hasn't seen him for 7 years. And he talks about how his dad returns as a stranger, like a total stranger to him. And that period from 45 to 48 is a period of ambiguous loss for that family. It's a family where the father does come back, but in most of these cases, the father doesn't. And I was really struck by a guy called George Mock. He gives a testimony to VHA, to the Shoah Foundation as well. And he talks about, like, he has this moment in his testimony, he tells the story of his father, and he says, you know, my father never came back from the Labour Battalion service, and we never found out what happened to him. And then he has this moment in the testimony where he says, you know, it's funny, I have this memory of being a kid in 1945, 46, and just hanging around by the apartment door, so by the big main gate out onto the street in the apartment. And I've always wondered, like, why did I spend so much time just kind of waiting by the door? And he said, I think the thing that I was waiting for was I was waiting for my father. Like, I was just waiting there, hoping that someone would come through the door, and that would be my father coming back from Labour Service Battalion. But his father never came back. His father was in the same situation as Judith. Is one of these boys, these many boys or girls, kids in Budapest in 45, in 46, in 47, who find themselves waiting by the main entrance door for a father who never returns because of the gendered nature of the Holocaust in Hungary. So maybe that just gives a little bit of context, situates Judith's story. In some ways, I think Judith's story is surprisingly typical. It really reflects in many ways, I think, a lot of what happens to Hungarian Jews in general, but also to Budapest Jews in particular.
Thanks. Thank you, Tim. Well, I have the difficult duty to wrap up our event and, of course, to thank everyone. My name is Christine Schmidt. I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. And on behalf of the library and our partners, the Stanley Burton Centre and the Institute for the History of the German Jews, I'd like to especially thank Judith Karpati and Louis Werner for their fascinating conversation about your poignant family history and the journey of research that you've both taken together, and also to Tim Cole for contextualizing the discussion and helping us think through the connections between different ways of knowing the past, in particular with regard to these distinctive aspects of the Holocaust in Hungary. I think Judith's story really demonstrates how the history of the Holocaust is not totally in the past, and in many ways is ongoing, especially for those who are even still trying to recover information about what exactly happened to their relatives, as well as these longer term repercussions of the history on their families' lives. So I wanted to thank you very much for sharing this and for being the core of our event together. And of course, I wanted to thank everyone for attending tonight and for joining us in this special event. We didn't have very many questions coming into the chat, but we did have a comment that I will share with Judith after the event, a very particular comment about someone's family history as well. So, and there are some thanks coming in now as well. So thank you again to everyone. I'll leave this open just because I think some comments are coming in to me now, and then I will record these and send these on to our speakers. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening.